Welcome to Reclaiming the Faith with Phil Baker, a podcast with a mission to reveal what the earliest Christians believed about the core issues facing us today. You can find links to all of Phil's resources at philsbaker.com. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen today, and take a moment to share this podcast with your friends. Now, here's Phil.
In episode 106, Dr. Judd Burton is back to talk about his upcoming book on witchcraft, The Book of the Gray. We not only talk about ancient witchcraft, but modern forms as well, and discuss how God's people of past and present times have fallen into syncretistic involvement with this forbidden practice. You can find links to this book and all his resources on his websites, tioba.org and burtonbeyond.com. You can also contact him at professorburton@yahoo.com to find out more information. If you're blessed by this episode, please consider leaving a positive rating and review on my Apple Podcast channel, Reclaiming the Faith. Also, you can visit my Patreon page, patreon.com/PhilSBaker, if you feel led to contribute to this ministry, and doing so for $5 or more a month will get you access to many previous videos, along with 2 new videos every month, one of an acoustic tutorial of how to play one of my songs, and also a video detailing one of the early Christians or an early Christian document. I'm blessed to be a part of Omega Frequency along with BDK and Kurt, who are putting out great content every week on our YouTube channels, Omega Frequency and Omega Frequency Live, so please go and subscribe there. Also, feel free to contact me if you have any questions about what I talk about here on Reclaiming the Faith at email philsbaker@gmail.com. Well, without any further ado, let's get episode 106 with Judd Burton rolling. All right, Dr. Judd Burton, thank you again for coming on Reclaiming the Faith.
My pleasure.
All right, well, Dr. Burton, can you tell us a little bit about your new book on witchcraft, and why did you want to write that?
Certainly. The book is called The Book of the Gray, and it's an anthology of sorts. In other words, it's comprised of articles and papers that I've written over the last several years. I've actually had a long-standing interest in witchcraft. One of my teaching fields, the religious history of early modern Europe, dealt quite a bit with witchcraft and magic during the what would essentially amount to the Renaissance era, the early modern era, leading up to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment period. And of course, as I worked on my anthropology degree, I also focused in on the anthropology of religion and ended up actually writing my thesis on a neo-pagan community. So it's a long-standing interest that I've had, not just from the anthropological historical end, but also from the biblical perspective, spiritual warfare sort of perspective as well. But it's broader in scope than my thesis is, because the papers deal with different taxons, if you will, of witchcraft over space and time. So it covers elements of the history of witchcraft from many different cultures and over different historical periods.
Wow. Well, yeah, I guess it's important to define terms since it's getting manifested in different ways at different times. So can you define for us the historical witch and witchcraft?
Well, that can be some murky water, but the best definition that I run across is really the anthropological definition, and it's it consequently fits well with the biblical definition of witchcraft as well. You know, witch is an individual, they may be male or female, who uses supernatural means to subvert or attempt to subvert natural laws for their own purpose, and they typically operate counter or anathema to whatever is considered the cultural norm or the cultural, what the normal morality is within that given culture. And these two things are the bedrock for any definition, really, of witchcraft. Now, you're going to find all kinds of modern, twists and variations on this theme, particularly when it comes to neo-paganism, which I treat as an entirely different, if you want to break it down taxonomically, that's an entirely different phylum or kingdom of the study of witchcraft. What I'm focusing on more and more these days is something that I've come to call the primal witch, which goes back to the pre-flood information that the Watchers shared with humanity.
So how would the primal witch compare and contrast? And I'm sorry, this isn't like in the notes, but it was just making me think. How would the primal witch, the pre-deluge witch, compare and contrast to maybe more of an Old Testament 3,000 years ago type of witch, like the Witch of Endor in 1 Samuel?
Mm-hmm. Well, the interesting thing about the primal witch, and I wrote about this in an interview with the Giant, is that it sets the precedent for the satanic witch or the Luciferian witch, because you have that direct tutelage between this nefarious fallen entity and the individual or small group of individuals. So that demonic tutelage is something that where the precedent is set for it in the pre-flood world. And so in that respect, or you're typically not dealing with the fallen angel who's teaching this primal witchcraft. In the Old Testament era and in the ancient world, it's the unclean spirits who are the heirs to Watcher knowledge, and they're passing that along to directly to a student. And there are a number of cases. You referenced the Witch of Endor, probably the best known of these kinds of people that trafficked in spirits. In fact, that's how she's described, is a person with an obe, which is the Hebrew word for a demon or unclean spirit. And people can read about this in 1 Samuel 28. And a lot of listeners, of course, will be familiar with the prescriptions against witchcraft and the Levitical laws about, suffer not a witch to live. Well, there was a reason that it was a capital crime, is because they trafficked with the spirits of the largely the Rephaim, these dead, the spirits of these earliest of the post-flood giants, who masqueraded as the dead humans, and so necromancy, divination of all kinds. These are sort of lumped together under the umbrella of witchcraft in the Old Testament, and so in that respect, it falls very much in line with the precedent that's set in the pre-flood world.
No, that's. Oh, go ahead, man. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it just occurred to me that the backdrop for the Witch of Endor, the story of the Witch of Endor, is that Saul had issued additional edicts beyond the Levitical laws outlawing this sort of thing in Canaan, and so these sort of solitary professionals who had existed in Canaan and the Phoenician lands before the Hebrews returned during the conquest era. When the United Kingdom is established, probably more so because of the direction of prophets and less so because of Saul himself. We already know what sort of a character Saul was as a king, but nonetheless, these individuals had been sort of driven underground. They were certainly still around, and indeed, the very story of the Witch of Endor, where Saul is actually consulting, these witches, or this witch in particular, also tells you what sort of a person Saul was, just in terms of his character and how devoted or how not devoted he was to Yahweh.
Yeah. I don't remember what chapter it is in 1 Samuel where rebellion is linked to the sin of witchcraft. And
yes,
and the Holy Spirit's taken from Saul because of his rebellion, and evil spirits given to him.
Right. Well, and there's a reason why that edict was handed down, that rebellion is as a sin of witchcraft, because it links back to the pre-flood world, the ultimate rebellion, the satanic coup against Yahweh, basically led to this corruption of humanity at the hands of the Watchers.
Yeah, and so even though Saul knew this behavior was forbidden, he was drawn to it, and it seems to be a pattern throughout the Old Testament and some New Testament as well. People that know the wrong thing, but they still do it anyway. Why do you think the children of Israel kept being drawn to witchcraft and kept participating in it?
Well, if anything, the Old Testament, the Bible in general, is a story of a lot of people who screw up and get second, third, fourth, fifth chances.
Yeah.
The image that's tempting to have of ancient Israel is that ancient Judaism was this monolithic religion, and as it was outlined in the Torah and in the Old Testament, and followed by the most devout, that it was. But we also find archaeological sites where there are graven images, idols of Yahweh with a female consort, which speaks to the syncretistic influence of the indigenous religions of Canaan, the worship of the gods of its many pantheon, whether those are the Baals or the Asherahs or whatever iterations they are of those kinds of deities. They were pervasive, and their influence was pervasive because the Canaanites were still there. The Phoenicians were still there. The Moabites were still there. The Amalekites were still there. These people that had lived in that region for centuries, in some cases millennia up to that point, were still in the land. And so that negative, diffusive cultural influence was always really at boiling point. We see what it did actually to the kingdom of the United Kingdom of Israel. You have the North complaining that, well, Jerusalem's too far away. We need to have our own analog to that up here. And what do? It ends up being a Canaanite style nexus where you find these things like graven images of Yahweh with a female consort. This pattern repeats itself, really kind of beginning with the Hebrews, complaining about, well, look at all of our neighbors. They have kings. We don't have a king. You just directly appointed these judges to rule over us. We want a king. We want to be like our neighbors. And, God is like, okay, you're gonna throw a temper tantrum. I'm gonna let you have your king, and you see how that goes. Yeah. And the historical record is very clear about how it went. It was divisive. They were, you had more reprobates than you did actual good kings in the history of both the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom periods. So those temptations were always there, and just in general, a lot of the Canaanite practices were linked with temple prostitution, and this was very common, not just in the Levant, but you find this in Mesopotamia, you find it in Anatolia, and you certainly find it in the Greco-Roman world. When John is living in Ephesus, he's right there. He probably saw it almost on a daily basis, the temple of Aphrodite.
Yeah.
Well, Aphrodite was no coy love goddess on a half shell. She was Inanna. Mm-hmm. She was the goddess of prostitution and promiscuity and warfare. Mm. And so this temple prostitution, the priestesses more often than not performed this function under the auspices of sustaining the fertility of not only crops, but also the fertility of people. And that involved this ritual sex, basically. And that, that alone was a huge temptation. And we see that it has these negative dividends over the course of the beginning in the United Kingdom period, and certainly, almost in your face in the divided kingdom period.
I can sense some of my, former teachers and, just church leaders pushing back on this whole conversation with like an idea of, well, that was just, the priests trying to control the people, and they've got perverted appetites, and, people have superstition, and that's why they get drawn into this stuff. But I don't think the people of, the first millennia BC or before viewed that this practice, witchcraft, as just silly superstition. It seems like they really believed this was real. They are getting in touch with real demonic or evil angelic powers that affect the weather, affect the crops.
Clearly.
Right, affect the ability to conceive, all these different things. And so, like, how would you answer someone who's trying to minimize the reality of these, at least the power of these practices?
Well, a lot of that stems from unfortunately, you see a lot of that even coming from pulpits and Sunday school rooms. A lot of it stems from bad training, from seminaries and things like that, because they don't, they've become so whitewashed by postmodernism that you're hard pressed to get that. But a lot of that stems from a misunderstanding of people in the ancient world in general and the way that they thought, and actually getting into their minds. Of course, they believed that all these things were real. They with all of their being, they did. And I'm not just talking about ancient Hebrews believing in Yahweh and His divine counsel, but all throughout the ancient world, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, these people were not only firmly invested in the gods that they professed to worship as real entities, but they also believed that there were certain entities, spiritual beings, evil spirits that meant them harm and had to be placated. And that's why you see, there are all manner of spells and incantations, outside of the sort of Levantine Jewish world, amongst all four of the Mesopotamian societies and all throughout the history of Egypt. You look in the Egyptian Book of the Dead or the Pyramid texts and the Egyptian tradition, and find any number of incantations against evil spirits. Garlic was thought to ward off some of these things. Mesopotamia, you find a lot of the same things. Not too long ago, they found a rendering of a Mesopotamian demon called Benu, who is basically one form of Pan in the East. This would have been an Assyrian version, and below this etching were incantations to keep Benu at bay. And so even in the pagan world, this idea of evil spirits out to do you harm was very prevalent, alongside with the gods that they believed in that controlled the various aspects of nature and their lives. So that's I'm fond of saying context is theology. You have to understand, as best we can this side of history, we have to better understand the mindset of the people in the biblical world. Otherwise, we're immediately guilty of projecting our own ideas onto that world that may not be applicable. It's really the highest form of historical crime, is the projection of one, not understanding context, and also the projection of ideas that may not be pertinent onto that time period. It was the first, the historians that trained me, it was almost like you were in a sermon or Sunday school when they told you that, don't do this. It's called presentism. It's almost as bad as plagiarism. So steer clear of it.
Wow. That's really good. An analogy that's kind of coming to my mind would be people of the 21st century that maybe haven't, in America, that aren't used to mafia families. Talking to people who grew up in, the early or mid 20th century, who were very much in tune with the way of the mafia, and just us talking to them like it really wasn't that big a deal. And they're like, no, the mafia controlled every aspect, of the world. And it seems like these evil spirits kind of operated like mafia bosses in a sense, where the people are trying to.
Exactly. That's a great analogy, because people thought that they had to placate them. It's like paying off the mob to, we're going to protect your neighborhood, but you got to pay your dues, every so often when we come to collect. Yeah, it's a very similar sort of mentality.
Well, kind of moving forward from the Old Testament to the New, how did witchcraft and sorcery clash with the New Testament church?
That's a great question. Often, in a word, but you have to remember that so much of the early church is set against the backdrop of the Greco-Roman world, and I say Greco-Roman because it's the Roman Empire, but Greek intellectual and mythological and religious culture is still very prevalent. So that you have this sort of syncretism, and a lot of the a good portion of what were known as mystery religions that people had to be initiated into, these pagan traditions, came from Greece as well. But you still had these solitary practitioners, who were referred to as practitioners of pharmakeia. That's a very common designation in the New Testament, and it means witchcraft or sorcery. And that's a very specific kind of pagan practice. They're still operating along the lines of my definition of a primal witch, and also the anthropological definition that we went over a few minutes ago. Historically, it's very interesting because Christianity has to defend itself apologetically almost out of the chute, because pagan philosophers of all kinds begin writing polemics against the early Christians, and so there's this back and forth that's going around in the Roman Empire between paganism on the one hand and the early Christian thinkers, most of whom who had been trained in the same traditions, philosophical traditions that these pagan philosophers had been trained in. So, much to their chagrin, they were sort of taken aback when these unruly Christians, as they often dubbed them, were able to match them argument for argument and often beat them at their own game. And so that's sort of the overlay of what's going on here. But in the background of all that, you still have these solitary practitioners, these solitary professionals, who are also at odds with the early church. The prohibitions against these practices are numerous in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, even from as early as Jesus's day, and all the way into the apostolic period, the early church, and you find these prohibitions against pharmakeia in a number of passages, and I think in many ways just as the Witch of Endor in the Old Testament sort of typifies and personifies witchcraft in that era in the biblical world, I think that Simon Magus kind of does the same thing for the New Testament world. They both represent, the tutelage of the primal witch, that I've been this idea that I've been dealing with, and in a case of Simon Magus, he was very interested in the power, in manipulating, this new power that the Christians wielded for his own nefarious ends.
Yeah,
and that's that wouldn't necessarily have been the case with all of the witches of the period, but Simon Magus certainly is. He's sort of interested in the ultimate manipulation of natural law. If God is the first and the final authority on natural law, then it's really the ultimate, kind of perversion or attempt to pervert natural law. And if you read the patristic literature, the apologetic stuff, these kinds of confrontations turn up there as well. Amongst a lot of the what were called the ethnophrenies, which is the period designation for unbaptized. They were kind of, I hesitate to use the word catechism, but they were sort of going through, early discipleship. So they were called ethnophrenies. Unbaptized is probably not the best translation, but it's the most prevalent. And you see a lot of these kinds of practices kind of holding on amongst these populations, as classical paganism is sort of, descending into the background in Christianity because of things like the Edict of Milan. And then later in the 4th century with, widespread, official toleration, and it becomes the state religion of the later Roman Empire. You read about these kinds of clashes that take place between evangelists and missionaries of all make and model, really.
Yeah, you were talking about patristics. Irenaeus writes about a guy named Marcus, the heretic, and he says that it appears. I'm just going to read just a couple of sentences, but he says it appears probable enough that this man possesses a demon as his familiar spirit, by means of whom he seems able to prophesy, and also enables as many as he counts worthy to be partakers of his charis, his grace, themselves to prophesy. So it's and then he goes after women, particularly nice looking ones that are rich. Yeah, it's really interesting. Can you talk about that word familiar, a familiar spirit, because that's used quite a bit?
Yeah. Well, the sort of popular understanding of familiar spirit is that it's the helper of the witch. It's an animal or animal spirit of some kind, like a cat or an owl or a bird, raven or something like that. When in actuality, the familiar is the demonic culprit. This is the tutor, and the only help that they provide is help that, in the end, ultimately is going to help their cause. And so the witch, in that respect, is just a kind of tool that the familiar spirit, makes believe that they're going to continue to give them the secret knowledge and power, that they feed to them piecemeal under the auspices of this curriculum for these witches. And that's not to say that it's not real, and doesn't, isn't efficacious. But to understand the familiar spirit, you really have to dig into the biblical context. And in fact, alluding again back to the Witch of Endor, this woman, again, is called in the rough rendering of the Hebrew, she's a woman with an unclean spirit. And so that there's a prime example of the relationship between the witch and her or his familiar spirit.
So the next question that I have feeds into what we've just been talking about with what role does the demonic play in witchcraft? In the patristics also, and I don't remember who talks about this, but they'll talk about how the demons kind of mimic some of the spiritual gifts. Like they'll mimic an exorcism by like causing someone to get. It's almost like exorcism and healing together. Kind of like Jesus will cast out a demon that can also, and it also brings healing. Like they'll afflict someone and then encourage them to go to the witch doctor to then do something to make the demon go away. But it really wasn't true. I don't know. It's the perverted version of like spiritual gifts. So like,
yeah.
How else do demons play a role in witchcraft?
Well, sometimes more overtly, sometimes less so. I mentioned neo-paganism a moment ago, and of course, these are going to be people like the modern Druids, your Wiccans, your eclectics, people from Celtic traditions and Germanic traditions. There are even Mesoamerican and Canaanite, neo-pagan traditions. Most of these people profess that their traditions are quote unquote white magic. And I know a lot of these people, and I think that they're interesting, decent folk for the most part, but they're still being deceived. And one of the disturbing things that I hear from some neo-pagans is that the spirits that they had traditionally been calling are now, quote unquote, in this day and age, becoming increasingly more difficult to control. Of course, the control is an illusion.
Right.
It was always an illusion. And so there's an example of a demonic stratagem at work in witchcraft. The more what I would call sinister demonic work. Well, my gosh, Trump just made a visit to McAllen on the border to try and bring more attention to human trafficking that's taking place.
Right.
I used to live in McAllen. I taught at South Texas College in McAllen, so I know the area, and I know that's probably the biggest conduit of sex trafficking, human trafficking into the United States, and it's controlled by Luciferians. It's controlled by the people who clearly embrace the dark path, who embrace the what Crowley and Blavatsky called the left-hand path. Now, here's an example of demonic influence with just nothing hidden in terms of its aim, and it's the stealing of innocence. It's the taking advantage of the terror of children, using that ritually. We hear that even that kind of stuff leaks into the media from time to time. We hear about things like spirit cooking and
it's like
my goodness,
adrenochrome stuff.
Adrenochrome, yep, which is increased in the blood, but through these rituals, these terrorizing rituals, often blood rituals. And I was going to say, my goodness, what's her name? The actress that was on Smallville, Allison Mackey, was just, she was part of a huge sex trafficking
NXIVM
ring, and yep, that's the one. It was just, released from prison after what, 2 years, a 2-year stint or something like that.
I think she was like the right-hand woman of Keith Raniere, right?
I think that's right. Yeah. I couldn't believe it when I heard it. I mean, I was a big Smallville fan back in the day, and I was like, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
That cute little blonde girl on Smallville. But here's some those are examples of the more what had once been more clandestine is now seeping to the surface. They're not as concerned with hiding it, with keeping the veil over it. I suspect that it has to do with, at least in some respects, has to do with the ramping up of the prophetic clock, as it were.
In Mozambique, and it may be that this happens all over, but there's a particular desire for albino people with the witches or whatever to find them and kill them. And you're talking about like innocence, this drive. Why is there such a draw? Why is there such a pull to apprehend and to mutilate and kill people? And a lot of times the younger, the better. Why is that with the witches and the demons?
Well, there's an instance, I'm drawing a blank on the passage, where there's a group of children that gathers around Jesus. And, the disciples are, crazy kids, get out of here, leave the rabbi alone. And Jesus is like, no. And then he goes off, on this homily about, basically, woe to anyone who would harm one of these children, because he knew, not just from his perspective, but he knew, because he was God incarnate, he knew that the innocence of children could be weaponized. And that's why he says that it's better for a person that harms one of these little ones to have a millstone tied around their neck and cast into the sea.
Wow.
And so there are these, Jesus peppers his homilies with stuff like this all throughout the Gospels. And you're like, I've read this passage over and over and over again, and I'd never, up until a number of years ago, had never put that into the context of what's going on right now with child pornography and sex trafficking and whatnot.
You use the term weaponized, that's an eye-opening term. With children being weaponized, how is that happening?
Well, a good resource is to talk to people, who were raised under the pall of satanic ritual abuse, and God pulled them out of that so that they could testify about it. And I've had a number of colleagues and friends, notably Dr. Greg Reed, who were like that. They were sort of being groomed, for that, and God took them out of it. There's something about the innocence and the purity of children. The younger, the better. Why on earth do you think that we've, as a society, have secularized child sacrifice under the guise of abortion?
Right.
It's the same thing as what people were doing in the ancient Near East when they offered their kids up to Molech or Bel. It's the exact same thing. And we think that somehow we can sanitize it under the auspices of legalized abortion. That's blood sacrifice. And certainly these kinds of blood sacrifices, many of them non-lethal, take place under the auspices of satanic ritual abuse. We know that because the scriptures tell us this, that the blood is the life, and that's not just something, and we could sit here and talk about how that links to the shedding of blood and the sacrificial lamb, and Jesus is the sacrificial lamb.
Right.
But the thing is that the sacrality of blood is almost a perennial in world religions, not just in Judaism, but clearly God wanted us to know that there was some sort of supernatural component to blood, that it wasn't just the biological oil, basically fuel, that kept us going and kept us alive, that there was something beyond that, that was part of the blood. And that's the thing that Luciferians and Satanists and these people that fit the definition of primal witch, that's what these people are after. That's what they're trying to weaponize at the end of the day.
It seems like, if you run across a demonized person, it would be pretty tempting to want to kill them. But that, based on what you're saying, like that would actually accomplish what the demons want anyway, because it's more shedding of blood. So,
exactly. Those people are already in the process of being terrorized, obviously.
Yeah.
So they're the demonic spirits are they're feeding off of that. They feed off of terror and fear. And you ask people in deliverance ministries, and they'll tell you this over and over. You ask missionaries that see this stuff, they're at the vanguard of it, really. They'll tell you really quickly that this stuff is real, because they deal with it all the time in the mission field. So you really have to be in the proper mindset, and if you've done deliverance ministry yourself, this, you have to prepare for it. You can't just walk into it, or else you might fall to your temptations. This guy's beating me up and scratching him around. It'd be a lot easier if I just sock him in the jaw and knock him out or whatever. But that's counter and anathema to the end, what you're aiming for in a deliverance. If the demonic can weaponize any aspect of humanity, they'll do it. They've been doing it for millennia. They're masters of this, and we forget that in a lot of instances, that they're heirs to this knowledge that the Watchers shared in the pre-flood world, and we don't know all of that. We're not privy to all of it. Now, through discernment, that may be revealed to us, but the bottom line is that the destruction and weaponization of humanity has been part of the stratagem of the demonic since the get-go.
You were talking about deliverance ministries earlier. How did the Jewish people of Jesus's day view exorcism?
Well, it was integrally tied with disease. And this sort of plays out with Jesus's ministry as well, because, a lot of the times when he's casting out demons, as you pointed out a minute ago, these people are afflicted with physical infirmities. They might have leprosy, or they're lame, or they mutilate themselves, like the Gadarene demoniac. And so this was something that was prevalent in the mindset of Second Temple Jews, but also for expanding that idea outside the scope of Jewish theology of the day. It was also the mindset of peoples in other parts of the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, contemporary with that period. The belief that the demonic and or evil spirits or what have you were tied with the diseases and physical afflictions of all kind. And so the work of in this case, or a rabbi, in terms of ridding somebody of a demon, or a shaitan, as they called it, would have more often than not involved some sort of physical affliction along with it. So those two things are integrally linked in that day, and they have been for millennia before that, and even in our day. The disease and the demonic are often linked. Kurt Koch wrote several books back in the 70s and 80s on that subject. He was a trained minister, and he was also a clinical psychologist. And he always said that sometimes that it's difficult to discern between the disease and the demonic, because so often they're linked. And he writes rather eloquently. If folks haven't read some of his books, I would highly recommend them, about this challenge because he's looking at the deliverance ministry not just from the perspective of a minister of the gospel, but also as a counselor, as a psychologist. And he recognized that very often, basically affirming what we find in Second Temple period Judaism, and also in the ministry of Jesus.
Was there in Second Temple period, was there a form of exorcism that was actually witchcraft, that was dabbled in maybe by the followers of Yahweh?
Again, you've still got this is before the church age, and you have to remember that there are two main powers, outside powers, that control Judea during this time. The first one, of course, is during the Hellenistic period. This is the Eastern Greek Empire, basically.
Yep.
That was ruled over by the descendants of Alexander's generals. In this case, the Seleucids, were ruling over Judea first.
Yeah.
And they brought with them, their gods, and it's when you start to see, Greek Greek pagan shrines popping up all over Israel. And of course, many people will be familiar with the story of Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificing a pig to Jupiter in the temple, which was a horrendous, abomination. And then when the Romans take over in 63 BC, and you basically have a client kingdom that emerges, the Herodians, in other words, basically become the vassal kings. Although Rome still had, consuls and tribunes there, basically, to sort of oversee what they were doing. Likewise, the Romans, many of whom worshipped Greek deities, continued that tradition of Greco-Roman paganism. And under the colleges of priests and the pontiffs and things like that, you still had these solitary practitioners, who offered their services for one degree or another. And so that temptation, just as it had been there during the United Kingdom period and the divided kingdom period, it still existed in Israel, during that time period, the Second Temple period. It was just that it was a different form of paganism.
Would that be like Asclepius stuff? Because he would be like a god of healing, right? And they would go through these rituals. And I was just curious if the exorcism is linked with healing, if they viewed.
Well, yeah. I mean, very often it was. Asclepius is a good example. At Banias, where I excavated and eventually wrote my dissertation on, there was an Asclepion. But of course, the main deity there was Pan,
right,
from which it derives its name. And epilepsy was thought to have been caused by Pan. It was called panalepsy in the ancient world. And one of the measures for, again, according to the pagan rite, to supposedly cure or at least work towards a cure for epilepsy or panalepsy, was to give offerings to Pan and to sleep in a temple that was dedicated to him. And so people would, we have, clearly it was happening at Paneas, but there were shrines to Pan throughout the Greco-Roman world. We have some pretty extensive accounts of the temple to Pan in Egypt, which I think was in Heliopolis, if I'm not mistaken, the big one anyway. There was we have records of a lot of traffic of people going there to sleep in the temple who had epilepsy or who had, night terrors or bad dreams. They couldn't sleep at night. All of these were thought to be afflictions that were either caused by and or could be alleviated by Pan. And so you do have that element to it. And of course there were Asclepions all, and little shrines to Pan all throughout the Levant where people could do this. And so that idea was very integrally linked.
So we're kind of starting to bring it home. A lot of this conversation has involved syncretism. How do you see witchcraft infiltrating the 21st century church? Not just like our culture, our American culture or whatever, but specifically the church today?
Well, that's a great question. And it shows up, I think, in a number of ways. Clearly the church has been on an odd trajectory over the last 10 or 20 years, moving more towards political correctness, moving more towards, congregations where the homilies don't involve mention of demons or hell or Satan or
the Bible,
anything, or the Bible for that matter. Yeah, I think you and I have talked about that before. That Jesus has become a life coach, and modern Christianity in the West has become morally therapeutic deism. I think that that's due to this nefarious, more subtle influence from Luciferian witchcraft, where you have these people who are actually infiltrating churches. And then there are other ways where you have the more New Age variety of witchcraft, kind of infusing the church, with what I call woo-woo, dangerous, but woo-woo nonetheless. The trend over the last 10 or 20 years to acknowledge the sacred feminine in the form of Sophia would be a prime example of that. And, that sort of harkens back to, things like what I mentioned, finding in the archaeological record, idols of Yahweh with an idol of a female consort.
Yeah.
Never in Scripture is God described as having a female consort. You don't have to go any farther than the Shema and Deuteronomy. The Lord your God is one. Not plus one, just one.
Right.
And so I think these are a few examples of how witchcraft has made inroads into the church, and it's largely not been epiphenomenal of contentions per se between either Luciferian witches, the primal witches, or neo-paganism, but this is stuff that's sort of creeped in, not at the vanguard but at the back door. And now in some congregations, it's out of control. People are having difficulty separating, what is sound doctrine and what is not, because this stuff has crept in, and they're not getting proper discipleship.
Yeah. All right. Well, this last question is a little bit more personal. I have a buddy who, whenever we get together, I'm having apologetic conversations with him. He's kind of he's de-churched, and he's a few years younger than me. But one of the things he said, he was talking about wanting to get into like some DMT, the ayahuasca kind of thing, and he was like, "I'll go to church with you if you do ayahuasca with me," and I'm like, "Ain't gonna happen, no chance."
Yeah.
Like, what advice would you give to someone who's seeking to have a spiritual experience through the use of DMT-based drugs like ayahuasca?
Well, the good thing about this is that I find that, whether they're interested in the sort of indigenous approach, or they're interested in neo-paganism or whatever, is that these folks are already willing to have the conversation.
Yeah.
In other words, they believe in a supernatural worldview. They believe in the gods that they worship, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing that you might tell your friend, and he's probably familiar with Strassman's, The Spirit Molecule, that book that he wrote on DMT, 15 years ago or something like that. One thing you might tell him is that, hey, our brains actually make DMT. You know that, right? There's a certain amount of it, in these experiments that Rick Strassman did at the University of New Mexico. He had, Catholic priests and Protestant ministers and, Buddhist monks, they were praying and meditating and all of this. And while they were doing this, they recorded these elevated levels of DMT in their brain. And so, what that says to me is that it's part of our makeup. God intended us to have that. I suspect that we had more of it in our system in ages past, because the farther back you go, the more in direct communion we were with the spirit world, especially with God. When you're in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve are talking directly to God. So there may be some sort of biological, component to that, but clearly it was meant to be part of our makeup, and it's part of our neurotheology, if you will. But the problem is that when you take plant derivatives of this, and it's always in larger amounts,
right?
You're opening up. There's no question that you're opening up that spiritual gateway, but the kinds of entities that are encountered don't have your best interests at heart.
Right.
And there's a certain amount of quantification that you can do with the experiences that people have on this, because they report seeing a lot of the same kinds of things. Two of the prevalent entities that they see are these reptilian-looking entities and clowns, almost in the vein of the Kachina dancers in the American Southwest. That's what I mean by clowns.
Yeah.
These sort of, in black and white stripes and zigzags and stuff like that. Your basis, something bad may happen to you. It may not. But you're opening yourself up to be used by these entities by ingesting, these larger amounts of DMT. I would challenge your friend to just be content with the amount of DMT that God is having his brain make right now. Seriously, though, bring that up to him. He may not know it.
Yeah. And it seemed like in the way that you're defining witchcraft, it falls into that category, because it's seeking the spiritual end through an illicit means.
Absolutely. It's that bending of nature again that I was talking about. And witchcraft is, we can do a whole episode on the use of, hallucinogenic herbs and salves that were made from plants that have been used by witches throughout the millennia.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Burton, for taking your time. Before I let you go, can you tell the people what you have in the institutes, any deals that you have, how they can contact you, all that?
Sure. Well, there's the forthcoming book. I should have that link up tomorrow. It'll either be up later today or tomorrow, probably. And it'll be available as an ebook first. I know a lot of people read things on their iPads and tablets and stuff like that. And the book is called The Book of the Gray. It's a series of essays and articles on the history and culture of witchcraft. Right now, the Institute, and I teach classes on this sort of thing too. The Institute's offering the certifications for $125 each. This is through the weekend. July the 4th. I'm not sure when your editing will be done.
This is going to be done on Tuesday.
Okay. Well, if people will email me and remind me that they listen to your show, I'll give them the sale price for the certifications. And that includes, probably most pertinent to our topic today would be biblical demonology and preternatural morphology, but also the biblical anthropology, the new certifications, the ancient Near East, Mediterranean civilization, and mythology are also on sale. New Testament Greek's on sale for $225 as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you again, brother.